Welcome to the Cafe Culture podcast, a season of discussions on culture, politics, philosophy and science.
At a talk recorded on the 1st of December 2014, Alison Younger discussed monsters created in our culture and what this tells us about ourselves.
I don't quite know how to live up to that, but I'll try and be as dark and decadent as we possibly can. I'm going to talk a little bit about monsters tonight and monster theory, which is kind of quite a new theory, I suppose. It's post-Foucauldian, it's a social theory. I'm going to talk about monsters, and hopefully it'll be slightly interesting for you. I see some of my students there, so if there's any questions I can't answer, those I teach hopefully can. So, I want to begin by talking about why we love our monsters, why we are drawn to monsters so much, why we have always, since classical times, been drawn to monsters. From we're children, they live under our beds, they live in our closets. We enjoy pulling the blankets over our head at night and imagining what's going on in there. We watch horror films, they haunt our every experience. And we just enjoy interacting with our monsters. And I'm going to come to a kind of conclusion, which is very Irish of me, Val, to begin with the conclusion. And I'm going to talk about the way in which we scapegoat monsters because they actually affirm our common humanity. When we see something monstrous happen on TV, or we hear it on the radio, or it's tweeted, or we see it on social media, we have to say that person must be a monster. As a human being, I can never do that. That could never be something. There must be something wrong with that person in order to allow them to do that. And so we love our monsters. We need our monsters. They make us who we are. And they've been here forever. Mythologically and in folklore, they're absolutely ubiquitous. You'll all come from different cultures, I guess. You'll all have your own monsters. We tell stories about them in many disparate cultures and countries. And yet, they have a number of common traits. Monsters, for example, are either very small or they're very large, depending on our social anxieties at the time. They can be carnivorous, they can be cannibalistic, but they're always fearful. They're always treacherous creatures. They confuse us, they terrify us, and most importantly, as my students would tell you, we can never really classify the monster. And that is what is most frightening about them. They cannot be codified, they cannot be classified. They invariably haunt inhospitable terrains. And perhaps most frighteningly, they have a habit of feeding on us as humans, which is always going to kind of make us a little bit afraid of them. They haven't always been called monsters, prodigies, marvels, freaks, fairies, witches, cyclops, enchanters, hydras, medusas. The monster's name changes over time, but then the monster also changes according to the times in which we live. In the medieval period, for example, if you were a monster, you were a result of spiritual damnation. Looking around at people in here, if we have any redheads, I apologise. But for example, in the medieval period, it was believed that if your mother conceived of a child when she was at that time of the month, she was going to have one of two things. She would either give birth to a werewolf or a ginger person. And either one of these had poisonous fumes which came out of their eyes. Why? Because she was behaving in an improper fashion. And because women behaved in this improper fashion, they would give birth to misshapen, damaged human beings. And you'll find in the course of looking at monsters, it's invariably the woman's fault. It's very rarely the man's fault. If we look, for example, at the male werewolf, he's cursed. Usually a witch has cursed him, and we feel some kind of empathy and sympathy for him. If it's a woman werewolf, it's usually related to the menses. It's usually related to the fact that she has PMT, and she's arrived at a point where she wants to harm people. So we're either separated through sin, or we're soulless. This is where we stand as monstrous beings. By the Restoration period, and the point I'm trying to make here is the fact that monsters reflect the social anxieties of their time. By the Restoration period, when we have the Civil War coming about, when we have changes in religion, we get Milton's Satan. Milton's Satan, one of the most interesting characters in English literature, the unrepentant traitor, whom Milton creates to be despised and loathed. And then the Romantics pick up on him and say, oh, great, he's the most rebellious character ever. We love him. Isn't he great? And from him is born the Byronic hero. And from the Byronic hero, we get Heathcliff and Rochester and Darcy and all of the characters who make our hearts beat just a little bit too much. The bad boys of literature. So, monsters. Perhaps the most scary monsters that we ever meet are human monsters. And this is something to which I'll return. But the great proponent of monster theory is Geoffrey Jerome Cohen. Where is my Stephanie? We love Geoffrey Cohen, don't we? This is what he says about monsters. It's in a book called Monster Theory, imaginatively described thus. Every monster has its historical specificity. The vampires of Anne Rice are clearly different from those of Bram Stoker, even if they are separated from each other by less than a century and filiate from the same genealogical tree. Now, the genealogical tree from which the vampires of Anne Rice are spawned, if you like, is the Lord Ruthven, John Polidori's famous Byronic vampire, who was born in, I think it's about 1816. And in fact, Edward Cullen, sparklingly horrible though he is has actually more in common with him than he does with Bram Stoker's Dracula. He is a seducer. He sparkles in daylight. He prefers moonlight. So Edward Cullen is much more of a Byronic hero. Bram Stoker's Dracula less so. Bram Stoker's Dracula, of course, is very monstrous in the novel, although films have changed him into this kind of hugely romantic figure who, I think he says, I have crossed oceans of time to find you. He becomes very romantic. So our monsters, the vampire in particular, reflect our anxieties and they reflect our desires. They are specific to their time period, and so we can learn from them. From a new historicist perspective, we can learn about the fears of that culture. We can learn about the interests of that culture. We can learn about the anxieties of that culture. And what is wonderful about the monster is it's massively protean. It will constantly reinvent itself, but its purpose is always the same. It will produce fear. It is something that we will never be. It is completely out there. It's far away from us. Again, coming back to the vampires, if you think of the way vampires originated, they were folkloric creatures who were usually buried at crossroads. They'd usually committed some kind of sin. And they came out of the ground to suck the blood. They were monstrous. They were revenants in their early phase. Now, when we get to John Polidori's vampire, it's a great big love story about George Gordon, Lord Byron. Polidori writes this story with this kind of terribly sexualized aristocrat who goes around, and his main purpose is not drinking blood. His main purpose originally is violating young women, taking their virtue. That, to us, is less shocking than it would have been in the 18th and 19th century, where a young lady without virtue might as well be dead. She had nothing other than her virtue. But vampires, we can take them back. Originally, if someone had catalepsy, if they had leprosy, if they had rabies, it was because of a vampire bite. The first, if I just bearing in mind we're standing in the northeast, the first recorded vampire from a folkloric perspective is actually, it was in Bedlington in the northeast. So this is where, be proud of yourself. The vampire is yours. So superstition creates monsters for us. Now, monsters are very sexual. They're very attractive. They've changed in the course of time. Vampires, they drink blood, but it's much more sexualized than it was in the past. They become much more romanticized. Stephanie Meyer's Twilight, for example. You know, you have the young girl, quite Czech, quite geeky. It's a Cinderella myth. It is not a Gothic novel. It's a story written by a Mormon about how it's right to have a teenage pregnancy and manipulate a young man and then stalk him, irrespective of the fact that he is a monster. We don't think of Edward Cullen as a monster, and he glitters in sunlight. I don't know, can I just throw this out to you? Is anybody comfortable with a glittering vampire? I have I know, Stephanie, you can cope with this, but I have great difficulties if we think the vampire is based on the Jungian shadow and now they sparkle, a sparkling shadow. I'm feeling a little bit of oxymoron in there. But there are those who actually like the sparkling vampire. And that's fine. It doesn't make them bad people. André Pare, this is one of my favourite texts. This is written in 1840. André Pare, who was a pseudoscientist of the early 19th century, he defines for us what creates monsters. And I urge you to have a look at this because you may avoid creating a monster of your own. He says, there are several things that cause monsters. The first is the glory of God. The second, his wrath. The third, too great a quantity of seed. The fourth, too little a quantity of seed. The fifth, the imagination. The sixth, the narrowness of the lady's womb. The seventh, this is my favourite, the indecent posture of the mother, as when being pregnant she has sat for too long with her legs crossed or pressed herself against her very own womb. The eighth, through a fall or blows struck against the womb of the mother being with child. The ninth, through heredity or accidental illness. The 10th, rotten or corrupt seed. So too much, too little, or rotten or corrupt. This works. The 11th, through mixture or mingling of the seed. There's a whole lot of seed happening here. The 12th, through the artifice of wicked spittle beggars. And the 13th, through demons and devils and the seed thereof. So quite a lot of seed happening here, and quite a lot of contradiction also. Monsters occur because something has gone wrong at the kind of moment of conception. But the one thing we can say about monsters is that they are always the opposite to human. They are not human. They are horrifying. Why horrifying? They are alien to us. They are terrifying to us because they are not us. They are fundamentally and absolutely not what we are. They are dangerous to human life. They are other. They represent qualities which our culture can never, ever accept. And, you know, when I'm talking about monsters, I'm talking about vampires and zombies and various things. But we've all seen cases of crime where we cannot accept this as a culture. We cannot take it on board. And so we have to put that person into the category of monster. Peter Sutcliffe, for example, he was a monster for doing what he did. So they make us feel safe. They make us feel good about ourselves because they are not us. They carry the crimes of our culture. And they range from the imaginary bogeyman that scares children at night to foreigners. Numbers of cultures. If you look at Dracula, for example, it's a massively anti-Semitic novel. You know, Dracula is very much like Jack the Ripper. He is the dangerous foreigner who is threatening the boundaries of England. And the question I want to throw out to you is, can we actually justify a single term, monster, a collective noun, for creatures who are so dissimilar, so different? So the question is, what is a monster? Etymologically, it's pointless looking because the word monster comes from monstrare, to show. So a monster originally was something that we looked at, something that demonstrated something. Invariably, it was sin. So it's pointed at, exhibited. The monster is something that we look at And so in order not to be a monster, you just have to conform and avoid having all kinds of strange seed. But that's another story. But you have to conform. This is why in the 19th century, things that we would call people with disabilities were actually put in freak shows. They were described as monsters. Joseph Merrick, for example, he was actually publicised as the Elephant Man, the monster, because of his disability. So learning about monsters can tell us a great deal about ourselves, how we view people, how we treat people. But they have a common source in that they are spawned from our fear of the unknown. The monster is always born into enigma. We can never know what the monster is. Another question I throw out to you, is a monster quintessentially bad or good? Are monsters always bad? A great example of this, of course, is who is the monster in Frankenstein? Who is the monster in Frankenstein, my students? Victor, of course, is the monster in Frankenstein. He leaves his child. But they tell us so much about our context, cultural context, by learning who is the monster, what is the monster about. The monster is very often also abhuman, in that the monster is a hybrid who is neither one thing nor another. David, I know you're very interested in steampunk. We often get monsters who combine elements of machine and man, hybrids pushed together, or we can have animal and man combined. Again, we cannot explain that. If we cannot explain something, it makes us frightened. It gives us a sense of existential angst. We want to codify. It's in human nature. We want to put things in a classificatory system. And if something is outside of that classificatory system, we become profoundly unsettled by it. And so the monster, when we stare, there is the great Nietzschean notion of if we stare too long into the abyss, we find the abyss staring back at us. The monster makes us actually look at ourselves. They are a profound mirror that makes us to reevaluate our cultural assumptions about race, about gender, about sexuality, about our very perception of what is difference. Because if we can classify a monster as something different, we can then see what we identify as the norm, what we think is okay. And that's an important ideological notion to take on board. And yet we love our monsters. Why do we love our monsters? Because they break the rules. They do everything that we would like to do, but we daren't. They don't observe limits. They don't respect boundaries. Monsters will attack and kill without compunction. I suppose every single one of us in the room has thought, God, I hate you at some point about someone. Monster doesn't just think it. They go and pull someone's head off. And the interesting thing about our monsters is that they say yes. Everything that is forbidden, the monster will always say yes to the things that are forbidden. And if we're completely honest with ourselves, there are times when we want to say yes to the forbidden, but society deems that we cannot, that it is taboo, that it is wrong. The monster doesn't care. The monster doesn't care about society. The monster lives for him or herself. And monsters refuse to be regulated. They refuse to be organised. They tend towards the chaotic. They don't have logic. Monsters tend to avoid logic, and they don't obey rules. And again, I throw this out to you. Every single one of us has wanted not to obey rules at one point or another. Pardon me. And what we love about them is they're entirely unpredictable. One of my favourite monsters, and again, my students will know this, I have a great passion for Edward Hyde. I love him. I think he's great. I think we should all embrace the Hyde in ourselves. As Jung would say, if we suppress our shadow, thereby is great danger. Edward Hyde is the unrepressed id. He stands for something that in many ways is much more honest than the hypocrisy of Henry Jekyll. He stands for the dark side of London society. Now, when Edward Hyde goes roaming around the streets of London, Remember, he only kills one people. Can I just make a case for Edward Hyde here? He is not a serial killer. He only kills one person. And I have, if anyone wants to talk to me about it, I have my reasons for that, for believing that he's a bit picked on. Edward Hyde, in many ways, is a much more honest creature than Henry Jekyll. Dracula is in many ways less sinister than the Crew of Light, these kind of all terribly British all-action heroes who hunt him down. Frankenstein's creature is a much more kind of at home in his environment creature than Victor Frankenstein is. So we have to think very carefully about monsters. We need them. We reject them, and we need to have them there to reject, because they're contradictory to principles. And I'm going to talk in a moment a little bit about the scapegoat. We need a scapegoat. We have to have a scapegoat. It makes us healthy. They're a negative mirror of our society. They're out there. They're not us. Cohen again says, we distrust and loathe the monster, but at the same time, we envy and desire it, because the monster stands at the threshold of becoming. So where we're tied in by numbers of rules and regulations, the monster is free of that. And the monster is always about to become something else. How? Because the monster is never really anything. We can never fully classify exactly what it is. And is a monster a threat or a warning? Yes. Monsters will tell us, that one of the famous monsters from around here. Has anyone heard of Sawney Bean? Yeah. Sawney Bean, yes. Sawney Bean, who was up on the Berwick coast there. Now, Sawney Bean, we don't know if Sawney Bean existed, but he stood as a warning in probability, because people were going to get caught by the border reivers. The people were going to probably get robbed by highwaymen on the way. And so Sawney Bean is created as a warning to stop people travelling on a kind of unaccompanied at night. And he makes us frightened. We don't go into dark places. We risk, by mixing with monsters too much, we risk becoming monstrous ourselves. It's that vertiginous moment of looking off the top of a precipice. Do I dare? Do I dare? Do I actually want to? And it's one of my favourite charismatic monsters. Anyone seen The Silence of the Lambs? Hannibal Lecter. We're supposed to recoil from him. He's a cannibal. And yet he has the most profound intelligence and charisma. And you find yourself in this position where you're recoiling, but he's almost mesmeric. We're drawn to him also. Monsters, Hannibal Lecter, how do we ever understand him? Well, the answer is we don't. If you try to go, is it in Hannibal where they say there is no name for what he is? If we name him, he ceases to have the charisma he has as a completely unknown person. We demonize them to make ourselves feel safe. They give us a notion of group sameness. This is where monsters come from us. René Girard, for example, in Violence and the Sacred, he says, if you think about it, we sacrifice our monsters, we kill our monsters. And René Girard says, the rites of sacrifice serve to polarize the community's aggressive impulses and redirect them towards figures that may be actual or figurative. So in other words, we will stop fighting amongst ourselves, and we'll find a figure that we can put all of our sins, all of our crimes onto, and then we will rid ourselves of that figure, and it makes us safe. It makes us feel better about ourselves and a community. So monsters can be very useful from that perspective. They can make us cease to fight. They can make us identify with one another. They transgress the boundaries. But they're born of our psyche. They're born of our imagination. They're born of our culture, of the religious needs of our society. I've never watched The Exorcist, but then I'm Roman Catholic and was raised in a very Catholic household, Irish Catholic household. And I've never watched The Exorcist, largely because I was so frightened I was too young at the time, it has to be said, but when the DVDs came out, I still never watched it, in case I got possessed by the devil. That was my great fear. And I actually, on my MA course the other night, my WAG students inadvertently, well, it wasn't inadvertently, they deliberately put a thing from The Exorcist up on the screen, and I couldn't watch it. I was rocking in the corner, like, you know, the man in the Blair Witch Project. But that, religious monsters frighten me. They scare me. I watched the other night, has anyone seen The Possession of Michael King? Don't watch it. It's terrifying. It's absolutely, it's awful. The man's eyes go yellow and he walks like a beetle. They frighten me. Monsters like that. We all have our own fears. We all have our own kind of fears, and it's based on our own cultural repertoire. We bring our own cultural repertoire to the monster and what we project onto it. That's what it's about. It's there for us to project our repressed fears onto. It's a psychological and it's a sociological threat. It's the things that we've thought about doing, but we would never really dare to do. And when we symbolically destroy the monster, we cleanse ourselves. It's gone. I don't know about the rest of you, but in horror films, I really like it at the end where the goodie wins, where good overcomes evil. I'm really good with that. I nearly fainted when I watched Carrie in the hand cave out of the grave. That bothered me a lot. Because we expect this catharsis at the end of a horror film. We expect it at the end of a horror novel, a Gothic novel, that good will overcome evil. It makes us feel safe. We feel that there's order in the universe, and particularly in the postmodern era where we have no real order, you know, where it's become very secular and unattached to anything. We want that surety. We want to know that we're safe in what can be a very hostile universe. So, what is a monster? Well, it's whatever we want it to be, really. We create them. They're our children. They're geared towards a particular people. And the study of certain monsters can reveal a huge amount about a given culture. I was talking at a conference a while ago about Gothic fairy tales. Val, this will mean quite a lot to you. Fairies in Ireland are just horrible. They're not little things that fly around like birds. Irish fairies are human-sized, and if you're not good to your children, they take your children away, and you can't get them back. And if you do go to get them back, you get stuck in Tir na Nog, and then if you walk on the land again, you just turn into dust. You know, fairies in Ireland are things to be avoided as much as possible, ever. My family are another group of people you might want to avoid if you ever go to Ireland. They're geared towards a particular people. People have their own monsters. You'll all have your own visions and versions of monsters because they're a projection of our culture. And there are two main ways that we read them in universities. We read them from a psychoanalytic perspective, i.e. we say that the monster is our repressed id. Edward Hyde is the ultimate version of the repressed id. And they're uncanny because of that, because they force us to think about what it is that we're repressing, which is kind of disturbing. And from a socio-historical approach, or a new historicist approach, Colin, because they articulate the social anxieties and concerns of a given time. They tell us they're a document, they're a text that we can actually read. And the scholars Olson and Olson tell us that there are 4 types of monsters. The first, human monsters. These are monsters that are very close to being human. Dracula is a human monster. Edward Hyde is a human monster. We then have superhuman monsters. And these are figures like Victor Frankenstein's creation. Dracula is a superhuman monster. He can crawl up the side of a building and turn into a wolf. Then we have animal monsters. The werewolf, of course, is your animal monster. And then we have what are known as inanimate monsters, zombies, although they are quite animated now, I understand. They can. I always live my life in a kind of haze of safety, thinking that if ever there was a zombie apocalypse, I'd just kind of walk in between them and shove them out of the way because they're so slow. You know, they're not terribly good at running, but apparently they're fast now, aren't they, zombies? They can run now, which is deeply, deeply disturbing to me. If you watch things like Night of the Living Dead and things, and you see these people and the zombies are kind of walking around, you just think, well, they're not quick. Just shove them over and run away from them. But now they can run. And apparently I understand that they can also love now, zombies. There's a new film, is it called Warm Bodies? Where if you're a zombie and you fall in love with someone, your heart will start to beat again, and then you'll just become terribly lovely in an Edward Cullen kind of way, and true love conquers all, because that's what we want in the 21st century. What is the paradox of the monster? They're extraordinary, and as Noel Carroll says, they're threatening and they're impure, but we love them. We cannot get enough of them. If there's one thing we know about Gothic, Gothic sells. Gothic has always sold. Since it's born in the 18th century, Gothic has always been a popular form of culture and a popular form of literature. I know you lot are going to laugh now, first Gothic novel that apparently had young ladies fainting in the streets was Horace Walpole's The Castle of Otranto, which if you read it now, it reads like a kind of bit of bad comedy. You know, you have the very effeminate young man in it, Conrad, who dies when a giant helmet falls on his head. You have statues with nosebleeds. You have walking pictures, things that we'd find risible in our world today. But Gothic was immensely popular then. It's immensely popular in the Victorian period. And now we're embracing Gothic again. Penny Dreadful. All of these things that we're watching on TV again. Gothic never goes away. Gothic sells. Gothic is sexy. Why? Because it's the dark side of who we are. It's the Dionysian. It's the area where rules don't exist. It's our id. It's our chance to watch people behaving like voracious and instinctual children. And if you think about the most horrible of monsters, the most damaging of monsters, these are the child monsters. Children. Has anyone seen Interview with the Vampire? Yeah. The little girl in that, I hate her. She's awful. I'm so glad she gets killed. She's awful. She's revolting, horrid little child. Because we expect children to be innocent. We expect children to be good. But children are very id-led. They're polymorphously perverse. They just want all the time. You get a child vampire, and she's just going to demand, and she's spoilt. I would smack her. No, sorry, don't. If I lived in the 19th century or something, obviously not now, because that would be inappropriate. Monsters are also less human to us. They have inferior genes, and they can lead us into some very dark areas, darker than the monster itself. Things like notions of eugenics. Monsters are created in social Darwinism. Monsters are created in eugenics. Monsters are created in Nazism. They're created as the absolute other. And if something is othered to that extent, if it becomes inhuman, we no longer feel the same guilt about killing it. So monsters are important on that macro level also. So what can we say about monsters? They're shape-shifting, we can't classify them, they're hybrids, they have multiple incarnations. They're outsiders, and that's the most important thing. The monster is always, always other, and they're always inassimilable. We can never assimilate them wholly into our society. They repulse us, they attract us, they can be pushed to the farthest margins of geography and discourse, but they always come back. Most monsters, you just can't kill them. Michael Myers, for example, human being, he's been pushed under a car, he's been beheaded, he's been chopped in half, he was burned, and he still comes back. At some point, clearly, he's become superhuman in the course of his multiple murders. They are the dark side of our society. They are a requirement of our society. They're everything that is rejected by our society. They're a crucible to everything that is contradictory to its principles. And I give you, for example, the femme fatale, who is born in her greatest kind of terrifying incarnation during the birth of the new woman. it is no coincidence that society is terrified by these women who want jobs and want to go to university and cease to be the angel of the house, and suddenly Gothic literature is producing Liliths and vampires and voluptuous women who are refusing to be ruled effectively. So what do we know about the monster? It's always found in the imagination. The monsters are always much, much more terrifying when they come in the imagination. They're outsiders. They're projections of our anxieties. They're a symbol of the repressed id, and they are abject. They threaten the very boundaries of our bodies. The demonic spirit can get inside of our bodies. We have no safety. We're frightened that this will happen. And so the monster is the violence that we must repress. We are the people who go with the burning sticks to Frankenstein's castle. We have to do it, not because we want to kill what is in there, but because we want to kill what is in here. Because that is a projection of what is in here. It is the part of society that we want to exclude. And I just want to end with a quotation from Geoffrey Jerome Cohen, which I think resonates for me, and I hope it does for you. He says this, and I'll end on this. Monsters are our children. They ask us how we perceive the world and how we have misrepresented what we have attempted to place. They ask us to reevaluate our cultural assumptions about race, gender, sexuality, our perception of difference, our perception of handicap, our tolerance towards its expression. Yes, monsters are our children. They ask us why we created them. Thank you.
Cafe Culture North East is supported by Newcastle University, Peels and the British Science Association. We're also supported by Ginger's Cafe in Dance City, who host the events.